Hello, listeners, and welcome to the TreeLines podcast. I'm your host, Paul Jeffries, and in this edition of the TreeLines podcast, we're happy to share the audio from our recent webinar, Timber Markets in Transition, the Role of Forest Genetics. In this webinar, our team of Reforestation Advisors hosted an engaging question and answer session covering topics such as genetic recommendation for future timber markets, tree spacing strategies for optimal growth and value, and how improved genetics can help you earn a return faster. Hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in to the TreeLines podcast.
Well, welcome everybody to another ArborGen webinar, and we're just really grateful for everybody's time and sharing this time with us today. My name is Jason Watson. I'm the director of our U.S. sales group. And I'm joined by our U.S. sales manager and then all of our reforestation advisors spanning a territory all the way from East Texas back to Virginia. So we have representation that spans the entire southern really forestry market range. So today the webinar that we're going to conduct today is coming off of an idea. We actually held a workshop out in East Texas about it's hard to believe it's been about a month ago, but one of the things that we were wanting to do is just address the topic of timber markets in transition and then the role that genetics plays within that. We've for years, one of the things we've been really adamant about is doing a lot of technology transfer workshops where we interact with forest landowners, professional foresters, and we do this obviously for technology transfer, but it's also because we just learn. We always learn. We come away learning more than we could have ever appreciated in conducting these kind of events and platforms. So today, like I said, the idea was that we had such a good meeting in East Texas where we were talking about these dynamic timber markets and then kind of how we think about, reforestation and the role genetics play, that we wanted to do this in a webinar forum where it could, comprise people from all over the U.S. South, but also maybe, all over the country for people that are absentee landowners. So what we're going to do today, it's a really unique opportunity because we have all of this. We have our panel, obviously, and all of our foresters that are reforestation advisors bring a wealth of multidisciplinary, skill sets to hopefully address the range of the questions that you may have. But in the spirit of what I just said about us learning so much and then trying to have good conversations about how we can get creative, managing our forest lands. And within that, how do genetics play a role in that? We wanted to get questions for you. So I think what we're going to do is you're not going to have to hear us kind of blab through like 30 slides and presentations. This is for you, and it's your platform to be able to have questions so that we can have some really creative dialogue. And as we go through this next hour. So I think with that, we've got a team helping us get these questions teed up for us, and we'll kind of get it kicked off without further ado. And I think you can submit your questions in a chat forum, I believe, is the way that this is set up.
That's right, Jason. We have a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and so people can feel free to start logging your questions in there, and we'll get to them one at a time.
Okay,
thank you.
So the first question is, with the dynamics of timber markets, what should I be considering concerning stocking rates so that I can maximize my ROI at harvest?
Well, thank you. That's a really intriguing one to kick things off. We're getting right into the fray. I know that what I may do is pass this one off to Paul Jeffries, who covers Mississippi and Alabama, because Paul, I know one of the things that he's in an area where there's still good pulpwood markets um, in the southern part of his range, and then there's he's in an area where there's just very different kinds of timber markets from one end of the states to the other, and he also is very active running the circuit and talking to landowner groups. So Paul, I'll let you take this one.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'd be glad to take that. And you're right. I work in an area covering North Alabama and Mississippi where we have varying timber markets, and we have an absence of pulpwood markets, and we have some pretty good saw timber markets. But it's a great question, and it's one that I get quite frequently. And the reason I get it, I think, is because with the depressed pulpwood markets that we have in this area, it's getting harder and harder for landowners to get that first thinning done. And with genetics that have been planted historically throughout the South, the lower genetics, the planting spacing of old used to be the 605, 622, 700. And with those planting spacings, you really didn't have enough room, or really don't have enough room, for the trees to grow and to really their genetics to shine, or the lack of genetics to shine. So without that pulpwood market in our area, that lack of thinning is causing a lot of stands to become stagnant. It's causing a lot of stands to become infected with southern pine beetle and with some of the other new diseases that have come out. Plus, with the past 2 years, we've had severe droughts in this area. It has really hit these overstock stands really, really hard. If you have, there's a term that when I was in college that was used in wildlife mainly, but it was called carrying capacity. And it's also applicable to forestry and ag crops in general, in that there's only so much water and nutrients in the soil that can only support so many plants or so many mouths to feed. Same thing with wildlife. So when you exceed or get close to that carrying capacity and you have something like a drought hit, it really hurts those trees because there's not enough nutrients and water there. So if you lower that initial planting density but plant a better genetic, you're really going to accomplish multiple things. Number one, you're going to ensure that if you have the years where you have droughts and you have limited availability of nutrients and water, you're going to ensure that there's more of it there for those fewer trees that you've planted. Number two, you're going to give the trees more room to grow. So instead of that first thinning being pretty much all pulpwood, that first thinning could be at the same time, depending on your mill specs, could be majority chip and saw at the time of the first thinning. So you're skipping that pulpwood rotation. Number three, you're going to give the understory, which is underneath the trees, you're going to give it enough room for sunlight to get down to it. It's going to encourage your forbs and your native browse to grow, so it's going to help your wildlife. And then on top of that, you're going to give more room in there for when it does come time and you have to perform a harvest. You're going to have more room for the large logging equipment to move around, which is going to minimize your damage from that harvest operation. So, looking at densities, I hear people, 454 is a common spacing now, 545 and 8x10, and 8x12 is 454, 10x10 is 435. That's becoming the norm in this area, Jason, and going down. And I've even heard of landowners going down below 400 trees per acre in certain areas, especially if they have the depressed pulp markets like we have.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it's amazing how much change we're seeing in people trying to adapt and, but also kind of trying to keep flexibility at the same time, for different markets as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul and Jason. So for the next question, we have, what's the difference between OP and MCP? And then how long does choosing between the two affect the stalking rate?
Well, who would like to take that one on? I could maybe share. We have a resident PhD candidate, Austin Heine, that might be appropriate for the
Yeah,
genetics.
I can take a stab at that. So, I think the question was, what's the difference between OP and MCP? So, we like acronyms in forestry. OP is short for open pollinated, and MCP is mass control pollinated. Um, the main difference there is that on the open pollinated, we know the female. Pine trees produce both cones and pollen, but when we graft a selection, we know that identity. So we know the mother that's producing that cone, but we don't necessarily know who the dad is. So when you buy open pollinated seedlings, the assumption that we make is, I think that 60% of the pollen is coming from within an orchard and 40% is coming from outside of that orchard. So some of it is going to be similar to a control cross. It's like a percent of that cone is going to be control pollinated, but another percent of that, we're not going to know the father. If you think about the MCP, the control pollinated cones, that's where we have identified superior families, individuals for the female component and the male component. So with the MCPs, we go up and we put bags on those cones in the spring in the orchards right before they're susceptible to outside pollen. We isolate them from outside pollen and then inject the male that we want into that bag. So we know the male and the female. And when you think about what that translates into, when that seedling's planted on your land, basically you end up with a stand with more uniformity with the controlled pollinated, the MCP seedlings. You're not going to have as many defects in it as you would the open pollinated, because with the open pollinated, you have a whole lot of different father components going into it. The MCPs, I always tell landowners when I'm trying to teach them about it, is it's kind of no different than like dog breeding or horse breeding, where we actually know the pedigrees of pine trees. So we've got these families mapped out. It's just like the pedigrees with breeding or cattle breeding. As far as how it impacts the stocking rate, I tend to bump open pollinated stocking rates a little bit higher, just because you're going to expect to have a few more defects in that. And that, again, is going back to not knowing the male, not knowing the father component, whether that came from within the orchard or was just wild pollen that came in from outside. And when you think about springtime and your car turning yellow, there's a lot of pollen in the air in the spring, and it can travel a long way. So you really don't know, who the dad is for all of those open pollinated seedlings. So again, with the stocking rates, I'll tend to go a little lower on MCP with more confidence that I'm going to have less defects, less rust, less forking in that stand, but tend to go higher on the open pollinated to kind of get yourself set up for thinning and thinning out those defects. I'll stop there. If anyone wants to jump in, they can, but that's, yeah.
That's good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Austin. So this next one, we are going to have Mr. Blake Sherry answer this one. This comes from Brad. What density was the study showing economic projections of the MCP elite planted at? And what was the basic genetics TPA density when compared?
So, Brad, yeah, I read your question through there. I don't know what particular study that is, but reading through the rest of it there, just talking about the importance of genetics versus density at planting and how that affects your DBH. recently got data back on a demo plot in my area, which was planted at 622 trees per acre with OP Select, OP Elite, MCPs. And then on the other side of the road, planted with the same families, but planted at 436 trees to the acre. And if I'm not mistaken, the trees are now age 8. And pretty much what we saw was that the MCP on average, I mean, it had larger diameters across the higher and the lower densities. But the MCP in particular on the lower planting density had about 16% larger diameters than the higher planting density for MCP. And for the OPs, it was about 5% bigger in the lower planting density versus the higher planting density. So the MCPs, and that was an average of the selects and the elites that we sell. So the MCPs are better suited to take advantage of the site nutrients when you lower the planting density because of the intentional pairing of those trees that are more aggressive growers. And with that too, it's not just the added volume that you get from that, but it is the added quality attributes. And coming from my background, I would definitely think that diameter growth is more important than height growth because diameter growth adds volume exponentially versus height growth adds it linearly. And on top of that too, the trees will be tall enough at the lower planting densities to be a marketable log by the time you're cutting them. So really, to take best advantage of the lower stocking densities, you need to increase the quality of tree that you're planting because it will, gain volume faster and it will put more volume into the product classes that are allocated towards, poles, saw timber, chip and saw, all that kind of stuff. Hopefully that answered the question. Let me know if it didn't.
Thank you so much, Blake. So this next one comes from Roger in South Carolina. So we will have Drew answer this one. The question is, what is the yellow fungus on pine trees in South Carolina and how do you cure it or prevent it?
Well, thank you. So that yellow fungus you're seeing is fusiform rust, and it's caused by basidiospores that are produced by oak trees. So all of our trees that we have, the OPs, MCPs, we have PRS scoring from the Tree Improvement Cooperative, and then internal scores as well for our proprietary families. So we have rust scores, and the best thing to do is when you're reforesting your stand is to work with us. Let us know that fusiform rust is a concern, and we can look at a rust map and determine where you are, your hazard rating, and then look at the families we have planted that year and try to find a good family that's got a good rust score. Fusiform rust can be devastating. They cause rust cankers, which really impact the bottom log of a tree and can significantly decrease the impact on the value of those trees. And they also cause mortality. They cause wind throw due to the cankers at the base of the trees. So it really can be an issue, and it's not something a lot of people get thought of when they're choosing their family. And it's really one of the most important things you need to be looking at because it can significantly impact the value of your stand.
Thank you, Drew. This next one is from Wayne. He is in Cedar Springs, Georgia, and he says that GP is shutting down the paper mill on August 1st, and they essentially have no pulpwood market now. He is looking from here on outplanting 400 plus TPA of MCP Elite and 2.0. When can he expect a chip and saw thinning? Around age 16.
Well, Wayne, I'm in, that's my area down here. And there's a lot of folks that are looking to do the same thing that you're talking about right now. When you can expect your first thinning is going to be highly dependent upon the site index of the site. And it's also going to be dependent upon the specs of the mill. Because, I mean, chip and saw, some people, the way they have it defined could be like a no but 5 all the way up to 11.7, depending on the local markets. If you are dropping down to that planting density on a decent site, Drew, you recently looked at a study, right, that showed that you should be expecting on, a normal site to have trees reaching the required diameter to get to there. If you want to talk to that.
Yeah, so we had a client in a poor pulpwood market commission a study through our forest planning manager where we looked at different planting densities as well as genetics. And what we found when looking at the optimum economic rotation based on their area, MCP lead at 454, the model optimized first thinning at age 16, which is producing chip and saw. And, the differential between pulpwood and chip and saw was 2.5 times. So in that area, the market they were looking at, it had a lower pulpwood price and a pretty decent chip and saw price. So the model, what it's doing is optimizing chip and saw production, and it selected first in age is age 16. So you're dead on the money as far as the trees per acre you're looking at and the genetics. The higher end genetics at lower density is going to allow you to push that thinning out a little bit and maximize solid wood production without penalizing you for delaying that thinning. Where as you're planting a denser stand, higher trees per acres, it's going to slow the growth down and have an impact on your return on investment. So you're spot on with what you're looking to do for your next rotation.
Okay, thank y'all so much. So for the next question, let's see. This is from Roger. He's asking, what is the best way to transplant pine seedlings, and how do you increase success? Is that by water, fertilizer, etc.? Jason, who do you want to take that question?
Jeff, would you like to take that one? It sounds like they're asking about different ways to maybe different planting methods. That's kind of what I get out of that. And
yes, correct.
Ways to increase your success.
Yep. Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, I'll take that one. I think the best way, that depends on how much money you're willing to spend on the planting job. The two options are hand planting and machine planting. In my area, there's not really any other options here. So the hand planting is a cheaper option, and machine planting costs a little bit more. But I think what the ultimate goal of planting and well planting a tree is getting it in the ground, getting the roots packed tight, and getting that tree planted deep enough. So I think you can do that two different ways. I think it's easier to get a pine tree planted with machines. I think in my experience, I found that's generally takes the human element out of it. The machine does the majority of the work, and it gets the tree planted deep enough, and it gets the roots packed. You can do the same thing by hand. I think with the number of individuals that are doing it, there's a variation, and people are humans, and they have good days and they have bad days, and sometimes the variation of quality and ability to control it is a little more difficult with the hand planting crew. And I think that what it boils down to is, and you'll hear J roots, you'll hear L roots, you'll hear trees that are planted shallow, trees that are planted loose. And I think ultimately what I found over the years is that if you get the tree planted deep in the ground and you get it packed tight where there's no air around the roots are contacting mineral soil, that you'll have what we consider a well-planted tree, giving it the best chance of it surviving. Does that answer? I hope that answers the question. And if anybody else has anything, I think that you can't control the amount of water that the tree's going to get. You can set it up for success by getting it well planted. I think the nutrients or the fertilization at planting is something that depends on the site, depends on the soil fertility. It's something that I think if you do at scale, is when I say at scale, if you're planting a lot of acres and you can buy fertilizer cheap, it makes sense. But I think that needs to be a targeted approach to looking at your soil, what's lacking in that particular soil. I don't think that it makes sense to just blanket fertilize a tree at planting, because some sites simply don't need it. But if that's something that's of interest to you, I would recommend getting soil samples done, find out what's limiting on that site, and apply only what's limiting on that particular site.
Thank you, Jeff. We will have Kylie answer this one from David. The question is, if I plant MCP 2.0, will I get higher yield of poles at higher planting densities than at lower planting densities? What is the effect on taper?
Hey, Kylie, you're muted.
Okay, Kylie's having difficulties. Jason, do you want to answer this one or have somebody else answer this one? I'll ask the question again for y'all. It is, if I plant MCP 2.0, will I get higher yield of poles at higher planting densities than at lower densities? What is the effect on taper?
Well, kind of, yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and then somebody can kind of tag on to maybe anything I say. The polls are, and I will mention kind of like when we do, value analysis, we really are we're extremely conservative with any kind of, economic returns associated with polls, because it can be the poll market can be, sort of, I mean, hit or miss, and when they can go up or when they are really hot. So we're really careful to put a lot of financial return emphasis on there. But so that's the first thing I'll say. And then obviously I do know that there are. I'm giving my full tilt disclaimers here for all this, but I'm just what I will say is that I know a lot of times there can be age restrictions. There can be maybe 25 to 30. Maybe you have to get to 30 years, or the poll producer, the people that are buying your wood to produce poles have certain age restrictions on those. But I think one of the things that to remember is that, like with 2.0, that's our highest performing MCP category. And there is a very, very strong emphasis really on all the MCP. The only differentials in our MCP categories are the growth or the volume. But whether it's MCP Select or 2.0, they all have basically the same emphasis on what we call saw timber potential, which is equal the value, really in terms of, I mean, my whole career volume has been king, but now, the quality attributes like disease resistance, forking reduction, and of course we're talking about poles, it's straightness or form. And you're not really going to see a difference with different tree stocking levels in terms of those attributes. So if I plant a stand at 450 trees per acre, there's not going to be a difference, excuse me, in the straightness versus if you planted 605. Because thankfully, straightness is a heritable trait that we can select for, and we've made vast improvements in straightness over the years. You used to hear a lot of people say, I want to plant. There was a lot of resistance, and I'm talking, 25, 30 years ago, in places where people wanted to plant slash pine or longleaf for straightness. But what we've been able to do in terms of, the variation that's there that tree breeders have been able to work with in terms of straightness for loblolly pine is pretty incredible, especially on any of these MCPs, because as Austin said earlier, when we eliminate that wild pollen that's coming into a seed orchard where we're trying to raise our improved genetics, and by selecting that father, it just increases the chances are so much better for like straightness. It's so important for poles. So manipulating really the tree stocking, down to a reasonable level, like 400 to 450 is really not going to change. that. And one of the things I will say, if anybody ever has witnessed this, it's amazing how many times I've taken people into a stand that's 454 trees per acre, and I ask, how many trees per acre would you guess this is? Everybody always guesses it's like 600. And that's because the diameter effect is so much, it really takes over. And so, but I think the biggest thing is Steve McKeon, who ran the tree improvement for co-op so long, is, you may want to stay away from the extremes. I wouldn't plant 250 trees per acre and expect to cut poles down in 22 years. That may be one of the biggest things to consider. I hope that answers.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much, Jason. This next question, it comes from Kathy. She's asking, why would I plant the more expensive MCP now instead of OP with the timber market so depressed?
I'll take that.
Okay, thank you, Drew.
Yeah, absolutely. So, really, it's important to double down when you have depressed timber markets. Jason talked about saw timber potential earlier, and what you see when you have OP families that have 30 to 50% saw timber potential, and saw timber potential, saw timber potential is defined as trees that are free of defect, whether it be forking or rust or crook. Trees that can make a chip and saw or a saw timber tree. So when you have your OP families that are 30 to 50%, tops 50% saw timber potential, and then you have the MCP families, which are 70 to 90% saw timber potential. What you're doing there, you can plant fewer MCP trees per acre, and you have MCP. It's really kind of a 60-40. On the value side, you're getting 60% of the values coming from your productivity, your growth, 40% on your stem form. So again, straightness, rust resistance, or reduced forking. So planting a more expensive tree will yield a dramatic increase in return on investment and what you're seeing for net present value and bare land value. Again, we recently looked at a value analysis for one of our clients, and that's what they were looking at. They needed economic justification to tell their clients to plant lower densities and higher genetics. And what we're seeing from real world measurements in our stands correlates with what our models are showing, and our models are showing, returns $300 to $400 per acre higher when you plant higher in genetics at lower densities. So it's you really might be contradicting what you think, why should I spend more money when timber markets are bad? But it really comes down to the differential between pulpwood price and solid wood prices. If you have a $5, $6, $7 pulpwood price, even if your chip and saw is 15, 16, your saw timbers, low to mid 20s, that's a big difference between your pulpwood price and your solid wood pricing. So producing the most volume of the highest value products is what's going to provide return in these depressed timber markets.
Drew, to add on to that, there's an old anecdote that I've had several people tell me that about half of what a logger is going to cut a year is going to be pulpwood. They're between thinnings, clear cuts, all that. In the past, been so heavily dependent on pulpwood because the markets were there, but also just the quality of wood that was out there. A lot of it had to go to pulp markets. And so by going to the tree that has improved quality traits, you're trying to kind of break that mold as a landowner. If a logger, half of what they cut is pulpwood, then that kind of implies that half of what you are growing with traditional genetics is pulpwood. But if you're planting the tree that does have a higher potential for saw timber and solid wood products, then you're not constrained to the same problems with pulp markets from 10, 15 years ago. So
Thank you, Blake and Drew. So this next one is from David in Mississippi. He's asking if anyone can help with an overview of the EUDR, that he has read a lot of information about the EU, and plantation grown trees will not be accepted going forward under these regulations. So who wants to take the EUDR question?
So, David, being from Mississippi, I'll jump in first on this and talk about this new thing that has come about and that people are talking about at all the meetings, the EUDR, and then I'll hand it off to a couple of colleagues. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about that. I don't know of anybody that is supporting it. I know it is a point of contention with landowners, especially across the South, and I encourage landowners to really look into it and contact your elected officials about it, because it is something that could impact the timber markets and forest management in the South. As far as hearing about plantation wood not being accepted, I know there are some stipulations that have been proposed in the original plan that I think they are going back and taking another look at. I did hear one rumor about plantation wood, but I think it was related to reforesting or converting a stand into a plantation that is not already a plantation. But I think my colleague Blake and Drew, they recently came from the FLA meeting and have some more information about that. So one of y'all want to touch on that as well?
I'll speak for a second, and then Blake, you can follow up maybe on the mill side. I think the main thing they're looking at is they're trying to keep land being converted from timber production to other uses, whether it be commercial or residential construction or ag production. So they don't want to see deforestation is what they're trying to avoid. And I think it's been kind of the first thing, it was supposed to go into effect at the end of last year, and there was a major pushback from the United States and other countries as well. So they delayed it for a year was the first step. And there's just a lot of misinformation there. But I think that the target was for them to be able to say, okay, this finished product, and trace the finished product back to a shape file of a stand, a clear cut on an individual's property, and say, okay, it's a year after this stand's been clear cut. It hadn't been converted it hadn't been converted into an alternate use such as construction or ag. And the main thing again is they're just wanting to avoid deforestation. So at this point, there's still a lot of misinformation out there, and I think our elected representatives and our trade associations, state and national, are working to educate about forestry and our sustainable practices in the Southeast. So right now, I don't think it's anything to be concerned of. I think we just sit back and let our state and federal trade associations and elected representatives, try to do their part. I don't think it's going to be any major changes for us. Blake?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. When I worked for both a paper company and a sawmill company, both companies were kind of gearing up and getting ready for increased oversight and regulation with this and how to mitigate it. And they pretty much came up with plans to do it. It's really a bigger issue on the pulp side than it is on the sawmill side, because most of our exports to the EU and wood product are paper related, but it affects the sawmills too, because where do they send their chips? To the pulp mill. Sawmills are a little bit, they can mitigate it a little bit easier because they can, separate out things that may be compliant or non-compliant and adjust the schedule for what they run to that. Pulp mills are going to be a little bit more strenuous, but they all support the same organizations we do on the state and federal level, and pushing back against it. They're prepared to deal with it if it does come to fruition, and they have ways to mitigate it if there's a tract that may not be, compliant per the last version of the rules. But that doesn't mean that from everything I've seen, all the sawmills and paper mills that, employees I've talked to, that they're just rolling over and letting it happen. They're all working as much as they can to either prevent it from happening or making it as much of a non-issue as possible.
Thanks, Blake and Drew, for chiming in on that. Again, I don't know of anyone that is supporting it. I think everybody is trying to figure out a way to change it, get it changed, or get it delayed or done away with. So, yes, back to the original question: contact your elected officials and have them put the pressure on, do their work in Washington on this whole issue.
Thank you all. So this question comes from David. He is asking, is it a better investment to plant OP containers or MCP bare root?
Who wants to take that one, Jason?
I was going to ask who anybody would like to. I mean, I will say this as an opening for that to answer that question is, what do we say in forestry a lot of times is it really
It depends.
it depends on your objectives.
I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah, you could go ahead. I was going to say,
yeah. So
I was going to see if Kylie's microphone was working again. Maybe it is, maybe not, but she can chime in too if hers is working. So she gets this a lot. So,
Kylie, you there?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I've been messing around with it, trying to get it to work. So just as a refresher, Jason, I'm trying to look for that question. It was should you plant, what's a better investment to plant, OP containers or MCP bare root? And as Paul mentioned, it depends on your goals and your preferences. Really the site, that's very specific as well. So what I like to do is just take out the OP container and MCP bare root because you can compare an OP bare root to an MCP bare root or, an OP container to an MCP container. But really, when you're paying that additional money for a container, it's for the entire root system to be together. It's for that soil media. That's why it's for when you plant it, it's going to start growing really soon. So there's so many different factors in it. Personally, on all of my family land, we plant MCP bare root. Jason actually has quite a few studies out there of OP containers and MCP bare root. And you have OP container and OP bare root, right? Beside each other. That's right. Okay. Saw your face.
Yeah.
Didn't want to misspeak there. But my advice is MCP bare root all day if your stand will allow it at a lower density, and you will definitely see that return in your investment. Paul or Jason or Austin, I saw you unmute.
I just want to say one thing really quick, and it may cause a little bit of twisting and turning, but I think one of the, and I didn't mean to cut you off, Austin and Paul real quick, but one thing I think ever since the a lot of people say, should I plant OP or should I plant containers or bare root? And it really, again, it depends, but it's like our answer a lot of times is yes, because there are different, and all the literature will support this is that, these, a lot of times it depends on, the site. If you're on a really rough site that may have a gravelly component that is going to be really difficult to plant, it might be a good idea to plant containers. If you're trying to plant early, or maybe you just are forced into having to plant really late, like in late March or April, then you may want to think about containers. But the biggest thing too is to remember that genetics and containers are not mutually exclusive of each other. I mean, we have a lot of clients that choose, they're very intentional about what they do, and they want to plant, an MCP in a container so that they may be going down to 450 trees per acre. So a very deliberate plan that's got really, the beginning with the end in mind. But I do want to dispel one little thing that's just a little bit of I think there is a huge misconception that the reason this question comes up a lot, and we'll thank David for throwing that one out there, is that I think there's a huge misconception that containers grow faster than bare root. And that is, if somebody has a study out there, it would be the first time that's ever happened. And we've had a lot of, there's been so many studies of that in the past, but you've always got to control the same genetics planted at the exact same time. Now, if you plant a container in October, it's going to grow faster than a bare root planted, in December. But if you're holding all those things the same, there's virtually the same exact, growth if you're planting both of those in December. So I think you've just got to think about, am I just looking for, survival? Am I worried about, losing a lot in terms of survival? But right now, you've got to factor in genetics because of the whole thing that's the topic of our webinar today is the timber markets. And so most of the people we see are being very deliberate. They're saying, I'm going to execute on my site prep and do really good site prep and control, and then put the genetics in there that are going to be aligned with, these dynamic timber markets. So sorry about that on my diatribe, but go ahead, Austin. I think you were maybe going to speak up.
Yeah, I wanted to take it back to the genetic level and kind of ignore the stock type part of it. So thinking about OP and MCP, and the answer is of it depends. I think another component of it depends goes back to your location. So are you, and adding it into rust is like, are you in a super hot rust site? If you think about the rust hazard maps that have been released from the Forest Service or from recent publications, if you're in one of those spots that's dark red that is like, hey, I'm in a high hazard area, rust is going to have a big impact on your total stand volume. So I would be doing everything I could in those areas to reduce the chances of losing stems from rust galls. That would be a component of the, do I plant OP or MCP, is, am I in a high rust hazard area? And if the answer is yes, you probably need to go with MCP. Now, I will say MCP is not rust proof. Like, you're going to still see some trees with rust, but you have to think about the hazard. Is like, if I go out there and the wild stands have 100% infection and the OPs have, I'm throwing numbers out, but 50% infection or 40% or 30%, your MCP is lower than that. Like, you're trying to lower your chances of losing trees for rust. So I do want to emphasize that I think it depends on where you're at too. I'll leave it at that.
And I'd like to add in on that, Austin. We came out not long ago looking at OP stands that were containers, and they had almost 100% survival. But at 15 years old, after, even though they had that high of a survival rate, the genetic component was not in the containerized seedling, and you were still left with a high percentage of pulpwood making up a stand that was really had really good survival. Whereas if you had used let's say, just for example, a bare root MCP, and put that extra money that you'd have put towards the container, put that towards the MCP, planted maybe a few more trees per acre, got the average survival of 80 to 85%, and with machine planted bare root seedlings, it's even higher than that. You can look at that and have an even higher valued stand there that is primarily saw logs and poles, because of those quality traits that are bred into the MCP. So containers get you survival, but genetics is what gets you value.
Thank you. This next one comes from Trey. We will have Austin answer the first part, and then Blake will answer the second part. His question is, at what lower planting density does delayed limb pruning and taper quality become an issue with sawmill acceptance? Are any genetics on the horizon to address tree form quality at lower plant city densities? So Austin, you go first, and we'll pass it along to Blake. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll go into the genetics part and the spacing. So I know the research that's been done on it, just says that I think you have to get below like 200 or 150 trees per acre before you really start seeing noticeable differences in like branch diameter. I've just finished measuring some trees that were put in a spacing trial up in Virginia. The widest spacing in that study was on a 10 by 20. And I guess it's in its 8th growing season, they were, even on the 10 by 20, they were averaging about an inch in diameter. There's not a major difference between the different spacings in that study. So I do think there's a lot of fear about widening the trees out, and that you're going to wind up with these giant branches. But I think the research that's been done shows that unless you're dropping below like 150 trees per acre, it's not a major concern. I will throw one caveat in there, in that I do think that if you have a very high productivity site or like an ag field that's high in nitrogen, you may want to keep your stocking a little bit higher, just for more branch control. We know that like on, fertilized ag fields that, your branching can get a little squirrely. So definitely paying attention to that forking score. That includes, ramicorn and big branches. As far as like what gets kicked out from a mill, that's where Blake, I was kind of hoping you could help us there. Just, to answer the part about, when something would get ruled out because of the branches being too big.
Yeah, so having run a quality program for a sawmill, coaling logs as they come into the mill and turning stuff around, what you'll see is a log or a truck will get turned around if the logger is pushing it, as in say there's an 8-inch top up there, but you have a ton of limbs below that 8-inch top, and so they are pushing. They're trimming off a lot of limbs, but they have a ton of knots in, say, the top third of the log, for example. That is when you'd run into a situation where the sawmill would tell the logger to cut it back, don't send all those knots, because knots are one of the leading reasons that it takes a board from being a number 1 or a number 2 prime, for example, down to a 3 or 4. So I would say, generally speaking, though, as long as a logger is cleaning up the wood, or they're being proactive on not pushing the top size too far or something like that, then you're not going to run into issues with taper or stuff like that. One thing I really kind of harp on people to know is the specs of the sawmills in their local market. What is their target log size? What, in terms of diameters, what is their target log lengths? I mean, a lot of lengths are, for a merchantable log are only 33 feet, 25 feet. There's some, a lot of ply log mills, for example, they buy 20-foot logs, 16, 14, 12s, 10s. So the height to me is actually a little bit, I mean, it's not as important as getting to the correct diameter and then having clean wood. And when I say that, you look at something and if it looks pretty per se, that does usually equal a higher value on the stump. Because when someone from the sawmill is going to look at a track and put a price out there on it, cruising is, I mean, a lot of it is subjective. Do I think this is going to make a piece of saw timber or not? So diameter, having the right length, and then having clean wood, I would say is what's most important to a sawmill.
And I wanted to jump back on before we leave that. I think the other part of that question was like, what's coming down the road with genetics? We will continue working on the population and improving it. I would say we'll keep working on the forking score and the like ramicorns, which that's a funny term for a lot of people, but it's basically steep, large diameter branches. That gets lumped into the forking score. So when we're measuring these progeny trials, we're trying to reduce forks and reduce those branching or the big branches. So I'd say that as we keep continuing to improve the population, like branch control will get better. The heritability on like branch size is lower, so we're not going to make as much gain faster. But I do know like when we make a selection, if it's a tree that's really woofy, has big branches, we will kick it out at the selection phase. So our product development team is very critical of that, and pays attention to it. So yeah, I think as we continue to improve the population, though, like with the forking and ramicorn scores, you will continue to see improvements in the branching.
Yes, thank you. This one comes from Eugene. He's asking, does the lower density produce more limbs on trees? If so, does that cause any problems?
Yeah.
Jason?
Who wants to
Yeah,
grab
go
that
ahead.
one?
I
Well,
probably talk too much. So
Yeah, who
go
wants that one? So the
ahead.
question again is, does lower density produce more limbs on the trees? And if so, does that cause problems? That's from Eugene.
So
I,
I'll jump in on that at the beginning and go back to the age old answer to every forestry question. It depends, because it depends on what the genetic is in the tree. Going back to one of Austin's answers earlier, talking about open pollinated versus MCP. If you're going down to a lower density, going back to the very first question that I took, if you're going down to a lower density and you're planting fewer trees per acre, do yourself a favor and plant a higher genetic, because you're going to have more control over that branch, that limb size, and that trait. If you go down to a lower density and plant an open pollinated seedling where you don't know the father that pollinated the flower, you're going to have more variation in the stand, thus possibly have more pulpwood in the stand. Then yes, the lower density could affect branch size. Again, it just depends. And you've got to, that's why it is so important on the beginning of your reforestation project to plant the best genetic you can plant.
Well, I agree with that, and really that question kind of brought me back to what Jason mentioned at the beginning of our webinar about our Texas genetics tour. We were in an OP stand that was actually a couple years older than an MCP stand, had very similar trees to the acre. They were age, I think, 15 and 13. Jason or Jeff, please correct me if I'm wrong on that. And you could visibly see that the OP had a lot more branches. It was a lot limbier, especially on the lower part of the tree. So that really just goes to back up what Paul said on that one.
Thank you. This one is it's from Gary. He's asking, as the genetics have increased the straightness and growth, how are you controlling combination knots that are more common in loblolly plantations?
So I understood the last part of it. Can you say the whole thing again, Joanna? I'm sorry. Apologize.
It's a two-parter. So Gary
Okay.
said, as the genetics have increased the straightness and growth, how are you controlling combination knots that are more common in loblolly plantations?
Well,
That's a new term on me, so I'll let somebody else take that
I
one.
mean, to me, that kind of reminds me of what we think of as like a whirl,
Yeah,
a whirl that,
ramicorn branching, like Austin was referring to.
yeah,
yeah.
I think that was Gray Skipper. So hey, Gray, if
Yeah.
I think that's who that was.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We knew
I
he would.
mean,
We knew Gray would ask a good question before it was over with. That's right. Thank you, Gray.
yeah. So I'm not familiar with the combination knots. I mean, I guess that's just like more frequent knots, but
Whirl, I would think.
yeah. But I think so. I think we're gonna keep controlling that. For one, is like we are kicking trees out of our selection process. So as we kick trees out that have big branches, or excessive branching, I think that will help. Um, that's, I think, slow progress, but that is some progress. But again, I think as we keep putting pressure on that forking score, and improving that, that may be a conversation for us to have with our product development team, is like, do we change the weights and put more heavy of a weight on the forking score? The more you put on one trait, the more you take away from another one. So like, do you back off some on volume to improve more on stem straightness, or reducing, the branch size? Um, you know, I know that we're going to keep working on forking, reducing forking and reducing ramicorn. So I think that should help some with the knots. But um, yeah, I hope that answers the question. That's my best stab at it. But if somebody else wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, I think it goes back to, I remember, hear people say this all the time. I think it's kind of what you said too in the previous question. It goes back to, we can, on paper, we can have a tree that's like got the biggest diameter, is straight. This is from the progeny test evaluations. It doesn't have a fork, and it doesn't show fusiform rust and all of the different test. But the old phrase, trust but verify, is so important. So if those kind of traits, like those combination knots, are showing up, or the whorls, it's going to continue to show up in the different reps in a progeny test. And so if you're following like a geneticist around in a test, that's why it's so important that they take the data that's on paper, but they're making those ocular observations and saying, I love this tree, but the seems to have this consistent issue with like whorl knots, or it has, or the ramicorns, like Austin's saying, or branches. But it's like trust but verify. Look at, what does the tree look like? What does the crown look like? Does it have? We're hoping for a smaller, smaller limbs, flatter branch angles, and that when we're making our observations, so they get picked up just by walking through and making those observations a lot of times.
Okay, thank you. So this will be our last question as we're at 1:30. The question is, what is your policy for acceptable length of time containerized seedlings can be kept in cold storage after lifting?
Well, I think, I think anybody would say, I know Tom Starkey would say, plant them as soon as you can,
Right.
There is a paper that's, I think maybe Auburn put this out. It's called the Lift Store Plant Pathway. And, but it talks about containers being stored, lifted during the dormant season, and still being stored up to like 2 to 2.5 months. But I think that would be like we've got anecdotal evidence of them doing very well, even planted in June after they were lifted in February. Now, is that ideal? It's not, but, and I'll be quiet there if anybody else has anything to chime in with.
I'd chime in, Jason, and say that the storage length for containers is probably not as critical as it is for bare root seedlings. There also, I mean, I would think bare root, you've got the chilling hours, and I think the chilling hours, 400 chilling hours gets you 4 weeks of storage on bare root, and it's definitely longer for containers than that. Would be something I would have.
Paul, I don't know if y'all can hear me. I must be too far away from the computer, but my addition to that would be what Jason said about, a couple of months after they were lifted with the container, and they have enough chilling hours in as much as they can with no deacclimation in the nursery. So if you have some containers that were lifted in November, you don't want to let those sit in the cooler until February, because they're probably going to be a little stinky and possibly a little moldy too. So you want to get those, planted as early, but like Jason said, depending on those chilling hours, and as long as there has been no deacclimation in the field, we get those spikes of 70-degree weather sometimes in the winter in the Southeast. You just definitely want to double check on that. And that is something that the nursery managers are actively doing. So you can feel, confident that if they were lifted that way, a couple months after planting, you should be fine.
Okay, thank you all. I did want to ask, this is the last one that we'll talk about, and then we can wrap things up. What are the benefits of hiring a professional forester to help manage your property?
Jeff, do you want to chime in on that one? I mean, you've definitely seen the whole gamut over your career in Texas.
Well, I would say the primary benefit of hiring a professional forester to manage your land is that, he's seen a lot. He's seen, start to finish. Foresters will consult with you on a start to finish operation. So that's locating a logger to cut your timber, to making the best recommendation on what trees to plant, when to plant, how to site prep a tree, how to site prep your property, and then then take that throughout its entire life cycle. So then there are things depending on where you are, depending on markets, depending on how much land you have, how much money you have to spend on it. He can make recommendations for you to, and depending on your goals, what are the best options for you, given your constraints, given your land management goals. You see it a lot. You see a lot when you're a professional forester and you're managing land for multiple customers. You get the gamut from goals of, I just want to manage my property to grow big deer, or I just want to have trees on my property, or I just want to have something that I can hand down to my kids, to I want to maximize my property for timber production. So there's so many different goals and so many different things to consider when you're managing your property, that a professional forester has seen it all, very well versed on the latest technology, the latest genetics, very familiar with timber markets, very familiar with what it takes for you to work individually with you based on your goals, prepare a plan that you what you want to do with your property. I would say that's, anybody else that's kind of been doing this for a long time could chime in on, but that's what I'd say the benefit of hiring somebody that is a professional forester who has a lot of experience and knowledge.
Okay, thank you all. Jason, do you want to give the final words, as we're a little bit over time here?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody so much for giving us your time today. Everybody's so busy with hectic schedules, so thank you so very much for being with us and submitting those really good questions. And I would just say that if we didn't answer the right way, or maybe we misinterpreted anything, hopefully a lot of people have our contact information, but if you don't, you can go to, this is really easy, arborgen.com. And our contact information is there. If you go to where it says find your advisor, you can locate our contact information, and we'd be glad to, whether it's an email exchange or telephone calls, we would look forward to discussing this with anybody, further. But again, just thank you for being with us. And we certainly always have challenging times ahead, but I hope that things like this help us. I know you've given us a lot to think about moving forward, so thank you so much again.